Hello and welcome to the panel discussion. My name is Randy Bird and I'm the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at Long Island University. I'm pleased to be here today because I believe universities across the globe can bridge the gap between policy and research-based solutions. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to disrupt life as we know it, this panel discussion will take a deep dive into both the drivers and responses across the globe. We hope to provide concrete outcomes and specific opportunities at the intersection of science, policy, academia, and industry so that we can respond to the current pandemic and build resilience towards the future. So with that being said, collaborative models can be difficult to manage and require strategies to organize all of the parameters. This can be addressed and formalized by the creation and an infrastructure for partnership development. But because ultimately it is the connection of data, knowledge, scientists, and stakeholders that will lead to the creation of actionable research-based knowledge. And as I mentioned earlier, I believe this is an area where universities can effectively convene and provide expertise to stakeholders and policymakers, creating a pathway to sustainability. As I mentioned, we have an expert panel. Today, joining us is Peter Schlosser, Vice President and Vice Provost of the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University, and Serena Sowers, a Senior Client Manager and Vice President in the Public Sector Solutions Division within Swiss Re. So I'd like to start with Peter, perhaps. Peter, could you provide a little bit on your background and then maybe talk about the pandemic as a stress test for our global future?
Yeah, thank you, Randy. I'm Peter Schlosser. I'm at Arizona State University, where I'm leading the Global Futures Laboratory, which is the university's instrument to look in a holistic fashion at the planet and especially the future of the planet. Within that, of course, phenomena like COVID-19, the coronavirus, the pandemic, are essential elements that we have to analyze and that we have to learn how to respond to. In my view, COVID-19 is one of the many expressions of the planet in response to the stress that we are putting on it from many dimensions. Since several centuries, we are actually accelerating development and thereby putting stress on all the subsystems of the Earth system. And we have reached a point where we are seeing limits to what we can do. And we are seeing that the Earth system is responding in many fashions, more frequently, at higher amplitude, and in essence giving us the message that we are asking to give us more than it has to offer. In many instances, we see that as relatively steady developments, such as climate change, temperatures rising. There are, of course, variations in it, but there is a trend upward. But in other areas, such as the health system, we have been warned several times through pandemics that we are moving towards one big one. And in that sense, COVID-19 is not a surprise. We knew it would come. It's not a black swan event, but of course we could not predict when would it come, and we could not predict how big the event would be. And I think for the first time, compared to SARS and MERS, for example, we saw a shock that came very quickly, spread very quickly around the globe, and came in a fashion that intersected all the sectors that define global society and its function.
Serena, can you tell us a little bit about ensuring natural capital for resilience, and then maybe talk a little bit about some of the shocks to the system and vulnerabilities?
I'm with Swiss Re's public sector solutions team, and we were established for a number of different reasons. But to start with, reinsurers insure insurance companies. While that doesn't sound like the most thrilling of topics, it gives us kind of a macro view of the many trends that we see globally, as well as locally and at the individual level. We have that enterprise perspective to track some of the trends that Peter just mentioned. And one of the things that we have been tracking over the last 40, 50 years, recognizing climate change as an existential threat to our existence. So there are a few things that I want to highlight here specifically. Our public sector solutions team was specifically established because of a trend that we noticed. We call this the protection gap, the insurance protection gap, where the cost of impact of various shocks and stressors compared to the insurance penetration that we see in our society, and figuring out who pays for the difference. So for example, the insurance protection gap for 2020 is around $83 billion. The whole cost of natural catastrophes that we experience globally compared to what is insured, there's a difference of $83 billion between those two numbers. And the question really comes down to who pays for these natural catastrophes, who pays for these shocks. And at the end of the day, it's going to be governments, it's going to be individuals.
Clearly, we talked about there's pressures such as let's say zoonosis, antimicrobial resistance, and then there's the use of sentinels and nature-based solutions. Peter, could you describe how these stressors and pressures could really provide a role for environmental and macro policy opportunities?
Clearly, one pressure is an increase in population. Another pressure is that we are much closer between the human domain and nature. So we are exposed more frequently and more directly to viruses, to bacteria. I mean, if we are looking at where in all likelihood that virus came from, it was from a wet market in Asia. And this intermingling of the subsystems in very tight spaces will lead to higher chances that we have a crossing of the virus from some of the natural systems into the human domain. Once that happens, of course, this can be amplified by other elements of stress. For example, a system that is already under pressure by climate change, by biodiversity loss. The ecosystems are not functioning the way they have functioned. The ecosystem services are not there anymore. That means, some of the negative feedback loops that could set in when we are getting into such a pressure situation have been removed by human development. So in that sense, we actually have made ourselves less resilient and more vulnerable. So one area where I feel the planet as a whole and, its entities, such as the political domain, were not prepared enough for these areas is disaster preparedness. We know about, in rough terms, we know what kind of events might be in store for us, but we are not at a point where we would be ready to respond adequately when they hit us. And that holds, in many dimensions, in terms of having the resources ready, having thought through what kind of responses we need, and being able to deploy the resources so that we can match the time scale.
Serena, you had mentioned that maybe this wasn't completely unexpected. So how can reinsurance play a role in the response, or what can we do as individuals or institutions to be better prepared?
Yes, perhaps I can pick up where Peter left off in regards to the resilience of biodiversity and ecosystems. Swiss Re recently established what we call the BES index, the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Index, to measure the resilience of communities globally. And as part of that, we look at a number of different factors, 10 different services that we receive from from nature to figure out how individual communities can recover from events. And I want to highlight specifically one example that I think can highlight how we can work together, both as public sector and private sector, in helping ensure for some of these essential services that we have in our community. So I want to highlight the coral reef that is off the coast of Quintana Roo in Mexico that we helped develop an insurance-based solution for. The fundamental aspect of it is coral reefs protect beaches, and beaches allow for tourism to thrive, and tourism allows for the governments to raise the fundamental tax revenue that they need to be sustainable. So you have an ecosystem in place that relies on each other to be sustainable. And Swiss Re came into play to figure out how we can solve for this solve for the economic sustainability of this community, Quintana Roo. And we helped develop an insurance solution that if a Category 4 or higher storm should hit the coral reef, which would destroy nearly 90% of the coral reef, we would provide an insurance payout that would allow for the rebuilding of the coral reef. So here you have an incredible solution where science solved for how you can help coral reefs recover, and governments figuring out how they can protect the economy of the community that they serve, and private sector insurance coming in to solve for the financing need that needs to be in place.
Thank you, Serena. Yeah, I think the working together is a very critical piece. And that would bring me to my next question, maybe for Peter. How can the academic, policy, and science community engage and work together?
So Randy, one example that is just with us right now, it's on all the media channel, is the vaccine against COVID-19. And that's actually a good example where academia, the private sector, and governments, the policy domain, really work together. You need the ideas, you need the research that typically comes from the research community, often concentrated in academia, but also in research institutes outside academia. You need some incentives, especially in crisis mode, when things have to be developed very fast, like in this pandemic. So you do need incentives or subsidies from governments, which was the case here. And then you need the private sector to scale it up. Academic institutions are not made to provide the vaccine for billions of people. That is not our role. But working together in these three dimensions, where the idea is developed, often coming out of academia, but then working with the private sector to get, in this case, a vaccine ready with support from the policy side, and then having the private sector really be the implementation space. It can scale up in a way that we could not. In this particular case, it does need sustained support from governments to produce the vaccine, to distribute the vaccine, to administer it at a cost that people can actually bear, or at no cost to many people. So that's an example where this really worked well, and it did lead actually to the development of several vaccines that are now coming out in record time. And the policy side also accelerated the approval mechanism, because that would be another hurdle that could prevent the vaccine from being delivered if the regulatory elements of government would not respond at the pace that is needed.
Serena, from a acceleration perspective, to move things forward and increase the pace for identifying, responding, and maybe even in the first place preparing for shocks such as the pandemic.
first is to, think beyond just pandemics, right? Because climate change, as Peter mentioned earlier, it has slow and steady with escalating impacts that we expect in the next 10 to 50 years to have devastating impacts on our society. And we know, for example, with extreme heat, the impacts that it can have on individual health is catastrophic. We know kidney disease as well as diabetes, among many other illnesses, are going to quickly escalate over the next few decades. And if we don't have systems in place to address these impacts, we are going to have we are not going to have a pleasant few years, let's say that. And we know low income and communities of color are going to face the impacts of these impending issues. I think we should be asking ourselves the question, how do we shore up our healthcare systems to be able to respond to the needs of climate change? How do we make sure the low-income individuals and communities of color are equipped to be able to deal with these catastrophic events? We are also in the business of thinking about financing these solutions, so that we're not waiting for the devastating impacts before insurance kicks in. Insurance, as we understand, often is a financing solution after a catastrophic event hits to pay for the costs that you've incurred. Where Swiss Re has really pushed the boundaries is to start thinking about how can we make financing and funding available for individuals, communities, and governments so that we can prevent the long-term impacts. 4 years ago, the question the World Bank raised is, if 7 of the wealthiest countries could support 70 of the poorest countries deal with pandemics, how could we set up a facility to help solve for it? I'll be the first one to say that there were many issues that people have raised globally around the PEF, but at the heart of it, this was one of our first attempts at figuring out, can we make hundreds of millions of dollars available as quickly as possible so that we are not relying on donations to respond to pandemics, especially in the poorest countries, but figuring out how insurance can play a role.
Peter, could you just make a quick comment in response to the financial aspects of all of this?
We have to get out of the pure problem-solving mode, which is a reactionary mode, into an anticipatory mode, where we actually can imagine what kind of issues are coming towards us and prevent crisis before it can hit. That means investment. That means the kind of investment that Serena laid out. I think if we are not getting to that, probably we never will get ahead of the curve, and we will not catch up with all the problems we create for ourselves. So there's a fundamental reshifting shift in our thinking that is needed in being much more proactive in shaping the future. So in that, with respect to that kind of thinking, I feel that we were way too passive in the past. We relied too much on the thinking that somehow we always were able to deal with problems in the past. So, we always will be able to deal with problems in the future. But I think we have to get one element into our forward thinking, and that is that there definitely are boundaries, sometimes called planetary boundaries, that we will face. We don't know exactly where they are. We don't know exactly when we will hit them. But if there is any good measure that we can use to project forward, it is just looking at how the world around us is evolving. And we know from our measurements that there are certain parts of the Earth system, climate has been mentioned several times, but you could also use the food system, you could use the water system, you could look at the pollution, just take plastic as an example. There are many signs around us that point towards the fact that we are reaching some of these boundaries. And then if you look at the moments of crisis, we have increased occurrence of wildfires. I mean, if you look at 2019 and 2020 combined, we have them actually from the Arctic Siberia, Alaska, through California, through Brazil, down to Australia. So we have massive occurrence of wildfires of an intensity. If you look at Australia, we actually created a new phenomenon, fire tornadoes that we have not seen before. If you look at the droughts that we have, if you look at the heat records, I could go to Phoenix, where I'm sitting right now. Phoenix is the hottest city. We had the hottest summer in 2020. Phoenix is the hottest city in the US, as I mentioned, but it also leads then to the highest number of heat-related deaths. And that is creeping up. It's not that we have that already under control. We are not yet on a downward trajectory, we are still on an upward trajectory. So we see these signs around us. We had at one point this summer, we had 5 hurricanes in the Atlantic. So this is not just one phenomenon that we are dealing with. And of course, you know, trumping everything is the shock of COVID-19. So we are actually seeing the warning signs in more places, through more phenomena, at higher amplitudes. And that really should give us pause. COVID-19 might just be a dry run for what we will see in a climate crisis. So we really have to become much more proactive, much more anticipatory, and prepare ourselves on many fronts in terms of the ways we deal with it, but also how we finance these measures that we can come up with and think about it. And final point, when people think about making different choices to have a different future, they immediately think of sacrifice. That is the wrong approach. If we are not changing our choices, we might suffer the ultimate sacrifice because too many parts of the complex Earth system might collapse, might go into failure mode. If we make different choices proactively, there are also financial opportunities, economic opportunities. For example, coming back to climate one more time, if we take carbon out of the atmosphere, which will contribute to keeping the planet cool meaning, you know, below 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming, we have to build $1 trillion industry. That is a lot of economic opportunity. There will be a lot of jobs connected to that. So change, different choices in themselves actually have a lot of potential for positive outcomes. If we are not doing them, if we are not making them, if we are not thinking about how to make them, we really might hit a lot of low points and a lot of sacrifice in the future. So we won't have a future of opportunity, but one of sacrifice.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. This was an exciting discussion. I look forward to talking more with you later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.